Economic Society. I'm sure that you're all aware that we are a campaign for changing the way economics is taught here in Manchester. We are wanting more pluralism, critical thinking and real-world analysis. So we do have petitions at the front here, so at the end if you want to sign our petition we'd be very grateful. Come and sign it. We're running this debate today in conjunction with the Manchester's Political Economy Institute, so we would like to thank you to them and to John O'Neill for all their support. So yeah, we have two fantastic economists with us today. We have Steve Keane and Peter Backus, and they'll be debating should and could economics have predicted the financial crisis. So Steve Keane will be arguing in favour. He's travelled here from Sydney, Australia. It's pretty exciting.
Thank God I wasn't here yesterday.
He's a long-time critic of mainstream economics, and his book, Debunking Economics, has been a favourite of the Post-Crash Society since our conception. He's the winner of the Revere Award of Real-World Economics Review, and for being the economist whose work is most likely to prevent a future financial crisis. So, fingers crossed. Peter Backus will be offering the counter-argument. He's travelled all the way from the Arthur Lewis building. He is a professor here at Manchester and is engaged with our society for some time now. He primarily focuses on applied economics and his research concentrates on charities and overseas development. It will give us, all of us at Post Crash, a lot of joy to see someone else on the other end of a debate with Peter Backus for a change. That'll be good. It's going to consist of two 20-minute time slots. So Steve will go first. You've got 20 minutes. I'm going to give you a reminder, 5 minutes. I'll be sitting there. Keep an eye on me. Let you know when there's 5 minutes left, and then I will stop you strictly at 20 minutes. This will be followed by two 10-minute slots where you can counter each other. Again, I'll give you a 5 minutes. Well, I'll give you a 2-minute warning this time. Give you a 2-minute warning, and then you have to be quiet. And then at the end, there'll be 30 minutes where we'll field questions from the audience. Not we, they will. We would. Field questions from the audience. And we just want to say that whatever side you end up coming down on, we as a society think it's so important that these debates happen. So, I just was really happy to see such a good turnout, and we want more stuff like this in the future. So, thank you very much for coming, and enjoy. Thank you.
I better say I don't know how much Peter and I are going to be disagreeing on this. It might be intriguing to see just how much we do differ. But the main reason I'm here is I happened to have a trip which dropped me in England for a few days, and I decided to gatecrash your society because you're doing today what I did 40 years ago as a rebel against what I thought was totally conventional, unimaginative and probably wrong economics, and that is still the case today. But what's very rare is a bunch of students like yourself deciding to get out there and stamp on the floors and do something about it and make people teach this stuff uncomfortable, so I'm applauding you. So, let's see where I come from. Why do I think we should have seen it coming? If you look at the downturn that happened in America and then look at what the politicians were being told by economic advisors prior to that crisis, this is typical of what was being said by conventional economists. This is the OECD's Economic Outlook published in June of 2007. The current situation is better than we've seen in years. Well, if you then graph what happened to unemployment in America, or the level of employment and GDP change, that's the crash you get in the GDP. There's the OECD prediction, the straight line you can see, and then the dotted line across the middle is zero, so below that line negative growth, which wasn't foreseen at all. And a large argument from conventional economists is a bit like saying, well, a bit like earthquakes, we know they happen, we can't say when they're going to take place, don't blame us for not predicting an earthquake. There's only one problem. Seismologists have a theory that says that earthquakes must happen. Economists have a model that say they don't happen. Big difference. So my particular background is to say, well, I've got a little indicator that I call the credit accelerator, which is that blue line. And using that, I've developed that since I saw the crisis coming, but that's building on the work I did beforehand. That gives me an idea that something bad is going to happen. Correlation coefficient between those two variables, 0.98 over 8 years. So you don't get much higher than that for economic correlations. And if I go a bit longer term and look at the correlation of the acceleration of debt to the change in employment, I'm still getting a correlation of 0.91. Now there's a slight problem with that correlation. According to conventional economic theory, it should be close to zero. So what's wrong? My correlation or economic theory? And it applies in the asset markets as well. That's showing you the real economy, GDP, then unemployment, and now looking at asset markets. Again, conventional economic theory says there's no relationship between the level of debt and the level of asset markets. This is looking at the acceleration, the rate of change of margin debt in America correlated with the S&P 500. That ain't zero. Okay. So I'm seeing a whole lot of reasons as to why the theory that I've got economic empirical validation. And that's to me the most important thing. And economists claim to be an empirical discipline, but in practice they are not. There's masses and masses of econometrics, but it doesn't tend to be based on a true juxtaposition of the data against the theory. And the usual case, as Kuhn argued, the theory selects the facts by which you try to validate it. They leave out the variables that I think are important. But before this crisis happened, the level of hubris that was occurring in conventional economic theory, I think, was beyond belief. Unless they were right, which of course we say they're not. This is a quote from a Nobel Prize winner, one of the two people who gave us the real business cycle theory, which became then ultimately new Keynesian economics by adding an imperfect competition to real business cycles. And here he's talking about what caused the Great Depression. And his reflections is saying, well, the Marxian view is that the system's inherently unstable. He says growth theory, which has proven to be empirically successful, which is bullshit if you check the theory, says this is not true. He said the capitalist economy is stable, and except for some change in technology, the economy converges to a constant growth path with the standard of living doubling every 40 years. That's Edward Prescott. This is Lucas. Macroeconomics, he claims, was born in the 1940s, which is strange because Keynes had died in the 1940s. But he's saying it referred to the body of knowledge that would prevent us from having a recurrence of that disaster. And speaking in 2003 at his presidential address at the American Economic Association, he said, macroeconomics in this sense have succeeded. The central problem of depression prevention has been solved for all practical purposes and been solved for many decades. That's the level of hubris that was existing in neoclassical economics before this crisis hit. What they were doing was largely turning a blind eye to what matters in economics. Nelson's eye to the wrong thing. And this is Bernanke saying he didn't particularly bother about one way of rendering Irving Fisher's debt deflation theory of Great Depressions. Because so far as he was concerned, a debt deflation was simply a redistribution from debtors to creditors. And without huge differences in their propensities to consume, it should have no significant macroeconomic effects. Now, he did go on to give a new Keynesian vision of Fisher, but that wasn't how he treated Hyman Minsky. Now, I presume most of you have heard the name Minsky now, before I mentioned it. Okay, I was a lone voice in my academic circles talking about Minsky before the crisis began. But this is Ben Bernanke in his essays on the Great Depression, and this is the entire consideration he gave to Minsky's explanation of where the crisis came from. He says Minsky and Kindleberger have argued for the inherent instability of the financial system, but in order to do so, have had to depart from the assumption of rational economic behaviour. Then there's a footnote that adds, he doesn't deny the possible importance of irrationality in economic life, but it seems the best research strategy is to push the rationality postulate as far as it will go. In other words, he paid no attention to an alternative explanation of the Great Depression, and yet he got the chairmanship of the Federal Reserve on the basis of being an expert. And as I say, he's not an expert on the Great Depression, he's an expert on explanations of the Great Depression that are consistent with neoclassical theory. And the only explanation that's consistent with neoclassical theory is the butler did it. Couldn't possibly have been suicide. But what did Minsky actually say? Well, he said, to begin with, that the fundamental purpose of economics should be to build models that can generate a depression as one of its possible states. Again, this is like the seismology. If you want to have a theory of seismology, you've got to have a theory in which earthquakes can actually occur. And he said, can it happen again? Writing in 1982. And if it hadn't happened by 1982, why hadn't it happened? Because financial crises were a regular experience in the 19th century, roughly once every 10 to 15 years. He said those are the questions that follow from the success of the previous 35 years and the crisis itself. He said to answer those questions, you have to have an economic theory that makes Great Depressions one of the possible states in which our type of economy can find itself. And by definition, that is not the case in neoclassical economics. It leaves it out. So what you got was a historical and a causal model of capitalism in which private debt played an essential role. And I'm still, 8 years after the crisis began, before I saw the crisis beginning and 6 years after it started, finding conventional economists cannot accept why I argue private debt matters in economics. Now, what he argued was that to actually analyse, he started from the point of view of debt, and he said the natural point to start looking at an economy with debt is to take an economy with a cyclical past that is now doing well. And my favourite point is actually before most of you were born, unfortunately, these days, but it's the 1990 recession in America that led to the recovery in 1993 that gave us the bubble of the internet and dot-coms and all that jazz. So starting at that point after the subprime crisis, everybody's conservative about the amount of debt they'll take on. And it includes a previous crisis. Everybody remembers this previous crisis. And therefore, everybody's got a large margin of safety that they build into their financial positions, having seen people who got too much debt during the crisis go bankrupt. But as the economy starts to recover, it's actually the people who had less of a margin of error, less safety, who do well. Leverage appears to work. And as a result of that, people think, well, the margin to safety is too great. We should take on more borrowed money, we should have more levered position. And what then happens is more debt is taken on, which increases the rate of growth of the economy. And I've shown you that with those correlations earlier, though that shouldn't happen according to conventional theory. And it starts driving up the prices of assets. So you go from a slumped economy to a recovered economy to a boom economy. And a period of tranquil growth leads to speculative excess. And we're seeing that again right now. So his argument was that stable growth, which is the myth of neoclassical economics about the nature of a capitalist system, that it should reach equilibrium, he said that is inconsistent with the system in which investment is debt financed. He says, therefore, the fundamental instability in a capitalist economy is upward. So rather than talking about a stable system, he's talking about an unstable one. Rather than tending towards equilibrium, if it's in equilibrium, you'll have a boom. He said the tendency to transform doing well into a speculative investment boom is the basic instability of a capitalist economy. Now, to me, that was the first vision of economics I'd seen. I've read quite widely, becoming Marxian and Austrian and a whole range of other theories, as well as neoclassical and post-Keynesian. That was the first one that really gelled for me completely. So what I did in 1992 when I was doing my PhD is I took a cyclical model of the economy and I added debt to it, financing investment. And it gave me a system with three states in it: the employment rate, the distribution of income, and now the debt to GDP ratio. When I simulated that model, I had a remarkable result that I wasn't expecting. It wasn't in Minsky. This is one of the times where mathematical reasoning, if you use the correct mathematics, which is dynamic differential equations, not the stuff that neoclassical economists tend to use, but true dynamics out of equilibrium. What it gave me was a period of apparent tranquility leading to cycles and breakdown. And that wasn't in Minsky. That wasn't a prediction of Minsky. That came out of the mathematics. And when I looked at it in 3 dimensions, because I now have 3 dimensions there, what I have is a rising ratio of debt to GDP. And what you get is this weird-looking vortex. The first time I showed that, one of my very favourite econometric lecturers, a guy called Eric Soe, lovely, lovely man, took one look at that and said, Steve, if you've identified anything that really exists in capitalism, we're in deep, deep trouble. Well, I think he was right, unfortunately. And at the time, it gave me a rhetorical basis in which to finish my paper, and you can tell I enjoy rhetoric, so I threw this particular line in at the end saying, the chaotic dynamics explored in this paper should warn us against accepting a period of relative tranquility in a capitalist economy as anything other than a lull before the storm. Now, that storm duly occurred after a lull, which neoclassical economists called the Great Moderation and thought was a sign of an improving economy. So they didn't see it coming because they ignored the financial aspects of the system, and whereas finance is what Minsky himself worries most about. And this is the reason why they'll make this case time and time again, that the overall level of debt makes no difference because one person's liability is another person's asset. And therefore, debt only matters if distribution matters. That's the argument you'll get them from people like, of course, Paul Krugman. Which means, of course, if you take that argument, you ignore trends like this. That's the ratio of private debt to GDP in America over the last 60 years, 70 years. and then you look at the rate of change of that, my argument was the crisis would begin when the rate of change started to fall. And that's exactly what happened. So there must be a way in which debt actually plays a role in the economy. And you can't see it by static models, you can't see it by loanable funds type models. It has to be a monetary model of capitalism. And this is where the myth of loanable funds comes in, because the normal argument that you'll see Krugman still hammering in his columns in the New York Times these days is that banks don't matter. But what actually goes on is banks are just intermediaries, like warehouses in which you put your wheat and somebody else borrows the wheat from you at a later stage. You might as well have wheat there rather than money. And banks are just warehouses. And so lending is from a patient agent to an impatient agent. If I can click here and not cause the system, but that's the lending flow, plus to minus, in the way I model it in my Minsky software. And that's seeing everything happening on the liability side of the banking sector and ignoring the assets. So the vision they have is that, though they're not quite aware of it, I think, that lending just occurs on the liability side of the banking ledger. Now, my argument is quite simple. Banks lend the money to non-banks. What that means is lending occurs on the asset side, so when bank lends, the asset rise, and lending then creates money on the deposit side, so the money rises, and you therefore have an expansion in the amount of money in the economy courtesy of lending, which affects the level of demand. And that completely transforms how you look at capitalism, because if you take the loanable funds vision, which is this conventional belief, then you can ignore debt, banks and money. But if endogenous money is right, you can't. So when I graph this model, I can simulate it later. We'll get my 10 minutes rejoinder time. I've got 6 to go apparently. If I fiddle with the rate of lending, then I have a change in the debt to GDP ratio, but GDP remains constant. Nothing happens. It's irrelevant. But if I do the endogenous money approach and I change the same parameters, then when I change the level of debt, I also change GDP. And a boom in debt can cause a boom in the economy, and a slump in debt can cause a slump in the economy. It's more complex again than that in the real world, but debt matters in one situation, it doesn't in the other. And I've embedded that. I'll give this presentation to the society later so you can download them and run those simulations yourself. I'll hopefully have time at the end there. So when you get it, you get crises in the economy coming out of this vision. This is now a more general model. I know there's some errors in this model, by the way. I've got to work on a stock adjustment mechanism for the capital output ratio. I'm doing that right now. But when I simulate this model of the economy, including prices as well, rather than getting that huge volatile behaviour I got on my 1992 model, I get just a collapse. And again, I can show that again with the presentation later. So we need a monetary vision of capitalism, and neoclassical economics argues we don't need it. And that's an argument it has to lose if we're going to get a reasonable economics. We also need to reform the education, and that's of course a major thing that you're doing by this protest. And I thought it was bad enough before I read the literature, before I got out there and read the journals rather than just the textbooks. But it's beyond belief how mendacious your education is when you take a look at the journals themselves, because you'll get stuff like this in Mancure. You've got Catherine and Nicholas, and you want to add their demand curves together to get the market demand curve for the price of ice cream cones. No problem. Simple horizontal addition. But if you go back to the basic theory and you see two individuals with very different indifference curves. You heard of indifference curves? Yeah, okay, you've suffered through that part of the course. Okay. Vary the indifference curves. You can't hold that pivot point constant anymore now, because when you change prices, when you're taking a look at a general situation where people own assets or have income earning ownership of assets and are spending, when you change the price of the goods they own, you change their income. So you can't hold that pivot point constant. So that mathematical logic should be shown here, and when it was investigated, it was found that you couldn't get that downward sloping demand curve. Now, if you've read Varian, have anybody read Varian's books, Hal Varian? This is how Hal Varian explains it. He says, the aggregate demand function, meaning the demand function for a market, okay, will possess no interesting properties. But if we assume that all individuals have what he calls indirect utility functions generated by what he calls the Gorman form, then you can get the demand curve you want, a downward sloping market demand curve. If you go and read Gorman, like he's quoting, what are Gorman's conditions? And Gorman's way of defining utility says that we can get the downward sloping market demand curve we want if we assume that giving an extra dollar to anyone will not make any difference to demand. In other words, we assume everybody's identical, and even worse than that, all commodities are identical. Interesting assumption when you're trying to aggregate. Go to the source literature for this as well, which is three authors called Sonnenschein, Mantel and De Bruyck, doing the same work somewhat later. And they said, when you want the law of demand, you want to know that the demand curve slopes down. Okay, that's the requirement of what's called the law of demand. You spend all this time learning it for a single individual if you do your indifference curves. It says, does this survive aggregation? You have more than one agent, more than one good. Can you put limits on the shape of that curve? And the starting point is say, well, can an arbitrary function be a demand curve for some commodity? And he proved that every polynomial, and that's any line you can draw by running your finger along the page, not looping back over and not having two values for one input on the horizontal axis. That is a valid demand curve. So what you get drawn in your textbook is a myth. They've proven that it can't be like that in a guaranteed way. They cannot rule out any curve you like being a demand curve. There's every continuous real valued function is approximately an excess demand function. You find me that in your textbooks, and unfortunately you find your lecturers who know that one as well. Most of them don't. So what you get taught is the law of demand, that downward sloping demand curve, is fiction on the theory's own basis. You can find other reasons why it might happen, but you've got to build a new theory of economics. Now, a sensible reaction to that was done by a guy called Alan Kerman some years ago. And his reaction was to say that given this theorem, it shows we can't add the demand of capitalists to the demand of workers. They will buy different things. So they said the sensible thing to do is to work at some reasonably high level of aggregation. And lo and behold, that's pretty much saying we should do what the classical economists did and talk in terms of social classes to be able to continue reasoning rather than working for the isolated individual. We should abandon the idea of working for the individual. That's over 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Why haven't we done it? Your protest is necessary to change that. Thank you.